Hello, everybody, on UKCrime.com land. I'm here with the legal thriller panel, and we're all going to be discussing the nature of writing legal crime thrillers. So if we can start with Tony Kent, who's going to describe his latest book for us.
Thanks very much. My latest book I have next to me. It's called Power Play. It's a political thriller with a bit of a legal element to it. I've got two main characters in my series. One is Michael Devlin, who is a criminal barrister with a suspect past, a bit of a dark past. The other is an intelligence agent called Joe Dempsey. This book, Power Play, is more really about Joe Dempsey than it is Michael. Michael's been the star of the show for the first two. Power Play, slightly more about Joe Dempsey. But we do have Michael in the book because the book begins with an explosion on a plane, on a commercial jumbo jet going between London Heathrow and JFK. That plane blows up. Somebody confesses to putting the bomb on the plane, and it's up to Michael Devlin to represent the person who has made that confession. At the same time, there's also an investigation into who would benefit from blowing up a plane that just happened to carry the prospective future president of the United States. So that's the beginning of the book. No giveaway that the plane blows up right at the beginning, and it all spirals out from there.
Yeah, complicated. So if we can go for you next, Kia.
Sure. So my new novel is Truth Be Told, which is out next Thursday. In Truth Be Told, we meet a 17-year-old boy called Cameron Hadid. He attends an elite all-male boarding school in London. He is confident and optimistic. He comes from a wealthy family and has a place waiting for him at Oxford next year. So all the pieces are in place for him. But then later on in the night, he has a drunken sexual encounter with a fellow pupil and has to ask himself a horrifying question. Did I consent to what took place? So Truth Be Told can be read, as a pure courtroom thriller, but it also examines the extraordinary stigma around male rape, consent, toxic masculinity, and asks the reader how they participate in that culture, how we can change it to allow young men to be vulnerable. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah. And if we can finally,
William.
Yeah. Sorry, William. Yeah.
Thanks very much. There's no sex in my books because they say write about what you know. So, anyway, this is my latest book, Bad Debt, and once again, it's featuring Robbie Munro, who is a criminal defense lawyer. Like me, and for those who haven't read the Robbie Munro books, Robbie Munro is to criminal defence what Richard Attenborough is to dinosaur theme parks. He's kind of gets things wrong at the beginning, but somehow they work out. So in this particular one, Bad Debt, bit more unusual than the others because this time it's Robbie who's in trouble, not his clients, and he is trying to get himself out of trouble. And he's charged with murder. One of the minor thoughts in the book is these days, because there's a politician involved, these days, what does a politician actually have to do before they will resign? But that's
it's very current then.
It's actually very topical at the moment in Scotland because the Lord Advocate, the then Lord Advocate, who's now a High Court judge, when he was a Lord Advocate, he prosecuted some football directors. You may know about this, and they just had to admit it was a malicious prosecution. So, but it would be inappropriate for anyone to comment about that, apparently. So I don't expect any heads to go there. So that's that's the book. Latest one, Bad Debt. There's a theme running through the book all about debts and the badness.
Yeah. That's a really interesting thing to start with. As lawyers, what do you think you could do to get away with murder? Because, of course, we've got all experiences about how we've covered it when we've written books and things. So what do you think you could do to get away with murder then?
Which one of us?
We'll start with Tony, sorry.
Oh, okay. I was going to say go with it, William. You look like you have an answer. Well, I think people get away with, in reality, if we're talking real life, people get away with murder every week. If you look at the amount of people that go missing compared to the amount of people that are living on the streets, there's a lot of people getting away with the perfect murder. To actually look at how you go about doing it, I guess having proper disposal of the body is key, and having no connection to the person. If you're connected to them, then ultimately most people are killed by someone that knows them. We all know what Strangers on a Train is about. It's a wonderful idea. It would really work depending upon the competence of the two people involved. I think that's the perfect way.
Well,
well, Tony's more or less covered the 2 points I was going to say. Get rid of the body and try not to have any connection to them. But of course, if you don't have any connection to them, why would you want to murder them? Unless, of course, you're a professional hitman, and I suspect there's very few of those around in real life. So that's what
I've represented a couple.
There's one or two, but I think most murders take place due to on spur of the moment incidents, as opposed to anything premeditated. And of course, it's the premeditated ones that tend to show up in crime fiction.
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, but I've read that lots of people go missing on public lands, especially in America. And so if you want to kill someone, I suppose take them on a hike and put them off a cliff and say it was accidental might be a good way to do it.
Funny you mentioned that. I had a client once, and he went hill walking with 2 other people, and it was 3 all together, and only 2 came back. And the other one's never come back yet. And he did ask me a couple of weeks later, how long do you think it would take for a body to decompose on a mountainside? And I said, I'm afraid I've got no idea. But he was arrested, but there's no evidence. So like you say, no body. They don't know. But I'm a great believer in, as Tony mentioned, it's always a case that, well, not always the case, it's usually the case that the police think it's a person associated with a family member quite often. They sort of start from the family member and work their way out, don't they, the police? Yeah. And they usually have a good idea. They don't always go looking for the evidence. In crime fiction, the police look for the evidence to find the killer. I think in real life, the police think they know who the killer is, and they look for the evidence to fit that killer, that person in the frame. And of course, quite often they're right, but often they're wrong as well. And that's where the defence lawyers and the QCs, like Tony, that's where they step in to do what's necessary.
I find unusually with murders and really high-profile murders, the police are rarely wrong. The police are very good at their job. And I say that as a defence lawyer. They're very, very good at their job in terms of getting the right person. In terms of proving it, that may be something else. But they're very good at getting the right person. The exception to that, I think, is high-profile murders. If you look at miscarriages of justice, you're looking at Colin Stagg, look at Jill Dando, all those sort of cases. When there's real pressure, when there's real media pressure to get someone, that's when they do the stupid stuff. And they go out and they'll nick the local nutter, basically, which is what they did in both of those cases. Yeah. My chambers that I used to be a member of was involved in both of those cases. And it's just, when you see how they react to sort of the crippling pressure of the media, it's really unhelpful.
Mm-hmm. That's when you get into this idea of pious perjury, isn't it? That's another thing where, you think you know who did the murder. So just adding a wee bit to the mix, something that'll be substantiate the evidence a bit more. Well, where's the harm if you're going to get the right person? That's a very, very dangerous thing to do. Yeah.
Almost always results in an acquittal. I've had 2 or 3 cases that should absolutely, on the evidence, can't say if they were guilty or not, but on the evidence, you would have thought it would have resulted in a conviction. And on 2 or 3 occasions, there is just a couple of little things added.
Yeah.
And you know why they're added, and it makes the whole house of cards fall down.
Yeah.
Very foolish thing to do.
The jury start thinking, well, they've added that.
Yeah.
What else have they added? And probably nothing. They probably haven't added anything else, but that one thing.
Well, it's an expression. In those circumstances, I always say the same thing in a speech. I said, they've lied to you about that. What else have they lied about?
Yeah.
And it's a question you can't really get away from.
No.
How does it come when constructing a legal novel? Does it help? Yeah. Start with Kia as as you've just told us about your second one, but you
I kind of start with an idea, and sadly I'm not one of those writers who have kind of dozens of ideas going in their head at the same time. I work quite slowly in the sense that I need inspiration to hit. And so for me, the really interesting side of legal thrillers is the fact that it's such an interesting platform from which to examine social issues. And so I think crime fiction and particularly legal fiction is such an effective vehicle for kind of examining those social issues in the context of a page turner, because often the people who enter the justice system are some of the most vulnerable in society. And so it's a really ripe area for examining how they ended up there and what systems cause them to be, then how we can change those systems. And so Truth Be Told examines kind of, again, the taboo of male rape, which I don't think has been covered in fiction before. I've certainly not read a novel that covers it, but it does so in the context of a legal thriller. And so it does it with a kind of light touch, without lecturing the reader, but trying to draw them into this kind of very contemporary social issue. And that's what draws me to kind of legal thrillers. And that I get the kernel of the idea, and then I build out the case from there.
What about you, William? I believe yours is unique because you've written about it on your blog, I think.
Right. Well, all my books, chapter 1, start off with something that happened to me, and it might be a minor thing, or it might be a major thing. The one before this one's not out until October, so this is really the last one. And chapter 1 is basically word for word what happened in one afternoon, and I just sort of write that, and then I sort of take it from there. If you've heard of high concept novels like What If, which is how most fiction, I suppose, starts. What if? This is sort of low concept. It just kind of, I write down what happened to me roughly in a sort of humorous way, and then I take it on from there. And Bad Debt is the first one out of 11 books where the first chapter is made up. It's not actually something that did happen to me, and that's because it was actually chapter 2. But I wrote another chapter, and I swapped them around. So yeah, I think if you're writing legal thrillers or about the law, certainly from a basic point of view, which I am, because my guy is a sort of criminal defence solicitor who's he's not doing high major investigations. There's not anything too dramatic going on in the sense of his Tony's doing stuff with aeroplanes and all the rest of it. But this is it's slightly more down to earth and a bit more basic. And I tried to keep it realistic because I'm a legal aid lawyer mainly. I get private work when I can, of course. And Robbie Monroe's the same. He does legal aid work, and you can't survive on one case. You have to have lots and lots and lots of cases. You have to be in court on a number of cases going on at one go. So in my books, I try and keep that realistic so that there's. I've held that up for long enough now. I think. I think you've got to give the idea there's lots of stuff going on, and that again is why this one's different, and that's because Robbie's the guy in trouble, so naturally he is only concentrating on the one case, and that's the one where he's trying to put up a defence himself with the assistance of his wife, who's a procurator fiscal. That's a prosecutor in Scotland. The law is slightly different in Scotland than it is in, well, it's quite a big bit different than it is in Scotland than it is in England in certain regards, but it's getting more like England every day.
Yeah,
I actually went to university in Scotland. I studied English law, but I studied it in Scotland, and we did a sort of parallel course. So I realised the differences. It's enormously different. It really is. But that was 20 years ago, so it may have changed now.
Well, the Scottish government's trying to get it more like the English law, as far as I can make out. It seems to be corroboration is slow. Corroboration's non-existent practically now.
Yeah,
I know, Kia, you're writing a book about rape, and there's a big thing in Scotland where people say, I wish it was more like England, because in England you don't need corroboration, where in Scotland you need the corroboration. But corroboration for a rape in Scotland is nothing. If a woman says, I was raped, and then maybe 2 days later goes to her friend and cries and says, I was raped, that's corroboration. Her distress is enough corroboration, even if it's 2 days later. So it's not really corroboration. But even then, the government up here is trying to get rid of it because they don't feel enough people are getting convicted, and they're putting that down to the need for corroboration. I think in England, I'm probably massively wrong about this, Tony, but I think in England, am I right to say that the Crown Prosecution Service, they will rate a prosecution if they think there's a reasonable chance or good chance of reasonable prospects for success?
It's reasonable prospect of success, yeah. A realistic prospect of conviction.
In Scotland, it's not. In Scotland, it is sufficiency of evidence.
Right.
So you can have two totally unbelievable people who, you know, that's enough. It's a sufficiency of evidence. Despite the fact that no one's ever going to believe them. Yeah. They'll still prosecute that. Whereas I think in England, it's...
Well, no wonder the rates of conviction are low.
Yeah, I had a rape case. I hate going a rape case recently where the woman had blamed umpteen people for rapes over the years. Now, you can't refer to these cases when you come to the trial because they ignore those. But on the way, she was getting taken to the court on the day of the trial to give evidence by a policeman and a policewoman, and she accused the policeman of raping her on the way. That's how bonkers she was. That's how mad she was. And yet there was the sufficiency of evidence was that she had said she was raped and she had been distressed when she said it. And therefore, that's a corroboration. That's enough.
Crazy. From the little I know about it, that needs changing, doesn't it? I mean, that's just crazy.
So I'd be quite happy to change it to English and realistic prospects of success, because they take so many rubbish cases to court, and that it does deteriorate from the real cases, the serious cases. Rape is a heinous crime, and you are convicted of it should get, you know, it just. But if you're going to start giving juries rubbish, then it will effectively it takes away the jury's trust in the I guess in the judgment of the police, because they don't know that that's the rule. They just think the police are bringing anything. That's right.
It's awful.
I don't know if that had anything to do with your question, Alex.
Going back to the question, I think I need to answer the question now. My purely legal thriller is called Marked for Death. That's of my 3 books that I've written so far. That's the one that is purely a legal thriller. And in terms of where that came from something, just as William just said, a what if. It was very much a what if. There is it's effectively 2 storylines that will come together at the end. One is a murder trial in the Old Bailey, and the other one is a serial killer who is killing members of the legal profession in London. And in terms of that part of it, when I was very new at my job, I went into my chambers. I was a pupil, in fact, and everyone was very frantic and very worried. And the weird thing with lawyers, criminal barristers, they don't normally get that annoyed. We get quite a lot of threats. So you don't get that worried about those threats because they're all the time. But they were worried on this occasion. And we said, why is that? They said, well, Mr. X is about to come out of prison. And my reaction to that was, well, what does that matter? And they told me some things about Mr. X, and they were very bloody frightening. And so I thought, oh God, well, and he'd vowed that he was going to get everyone that had sentenced to prison 15 years before. I went in the next day and everyone was fine again. And I said, so what's happened? They said, well, they spun his cell last night. They searched his cell before he left, which is quite often what happens. And they had found his kill list. And he had a list of everyone he considered an enemy from the trial. He knew where they all now were, including a chief inspector police officer who was now a solicitor. He'd found them all, and he was going to kill them all. And so they kept him inside. He will probably never come out now. I hope he doesn't, if he ever hears this. And they so I looked at that and I thought, well, wouldn't that be a really good story if they hadn't found that list? So that effectively is half of what Marked for Death is. The other half of Marked for Death is just a jury trial. And what I did in relation to that jury trial, because barristers are bastards, frankly, they would have loved to find something wrong with the trial. They would have loved to look at it and say, well, that just doesn't happen. That's not realistic. And in fairness, I will watch something on TV and do exactly that. But I just felt a huge pressure to make sure I got the law right. Obviously, you've got to condense it and make it entertaining, and but you still can't get it wrong if you're me, because I will get it in the neck at work. So I actually just took 3 or 4 cross-examinations I'd done and condensed them and made the barrister look better, in fairness, but condensed them and then built a case around them. So my idea for the case was whatever would fit into these 4 disparate cross-examinations from different cases, make them all apply to the one case. So it's interesting.
Do you not feel that you can take a bit of a creative license? Because often, I mean, certainly, for example, in a police case, there's cross-examination, cross-contamination. So, but from a novelist's point of view, you don't want to introduce another character to be doing the second interview. So you might just use the same character to do the 2 interviews when in reality there'd be 2 characters. So how do you deal with the tension between what's easier for a novelist and what's accurate for a lawyer?
Well, I make sure that it is 100% accurate in terms of what could happen, but it's condensed. It's condensed. It's sped up. It's made more interesting. It's made more entertaining. I've got a 30-page chapter that's a cross-examination on cell site material, and if I wrote it properly, that would be a 500-page chapter. So really, it's just condensing it, getting rid of technical terms, just making it flow that bit better. But ultimately, people love to watch criminal TV shows. And when they go well, when your trials go well, they are kind of entertaining. Those small parts of it. If you were to watch the whole trial from beginning to end, you'd be bored out to tears. But if you just watch that one cross-examination, then you will really enjoy it if it's a good one. And I had the freedom of stealing 4 good ones from 20 years. So even I've managed 4 good ones.
But I think Tony's right about condensing things, not just in court cases, but just the general legal system. It's a very slow process getting from someone charged through to the end. And in my books, they normally have a sort of period. They normally cover a period of about 6 weeks, and so that's hopeless for like a trial, because the trial probably takes 6 weeks, far less the whole thing. So you've got to think of reasons why. It's suddenly been condensed. They've brought the case quickly for some reason, and it's like with Robbie Munro. With legal aid being what it is in Scotland, you can't properly investigate a case anymore. Years ago, you could. It's just about impossible to do it now. And he just basically has to find private clients who are quite wealthy a lot of the time, who will actually cover the cost. Otherwise, just go out of business. It's as simple as that. You can't concentrate on one case on legal aid, because I don't know if you know how much we get paid in Scotland. Just say you're in a murder case and I've got the right to a witness. I want to speak to him as a witness. Do you see what happened? I want to write my letter. Now we get 98 pence for doing that. 98 pence, and that includes a stamp. Stamp's like 60 odd pence or something. It's just ridiculous. You couldn't possibly. And for that reason, you'll find that a lot of corners are now having to be cut in criminal defence work in Scotland. And I could tell you a long story about one where I nearly cut a corner, and because I didn't cut the corner, we won the murder case. And it's just terribly scary, because I could so easily not have bothered doing that. And I just thought, no, let's do it and see. And it was all to do with timings of when a shop closed. And it was a cold case from a long time ago. And of course, the closing time had changed. And I thought, let's maybe go back in time and see when the shop closed back then, as opposed to when it closes now. And that made the whole difference to the whole case. So it's not sure where I was going with that, other than to say you've got to you can't make it too. You've got to keep the law correct, I think, in a legal thriller. If you don't, people will get on your case, especially if you are a lawyer, you'll get pulled up. So you've got to try and get that right, but you have to condense things somehow and make it still be believable.
What about the art of repetition? Because obviously in a trial, you go through the evidence as if it's a story and thing. But obviously in a book, you explain the case beforehand, and in a trial you go through it again. So what's it like in a novel? In
the ones I write them from the barrister's perspective. So really, when it's a legal thriller, so the crime's been done, and you're finding out as the barrister finds out. I guess the story's really being told in the prison, in the court. Pardon me. So because otherwise that would be a real problem. You're telling the same story twice, maybe 3 times.
Yeah. How did you find that, Keir, when you were doing your first one? Because obviously it's a challenge when you write your first book.
I try to kind of break it down so that something new was being revealed in each scene. And so, it does take a little bit of a sleight of hand, because obviously in a real court case, they would be going over the facts again. But I would skip over those bits to a new piece of information or something that makes the reader go, oh, maybe I was wrong, or maybe XYZ was right. And so, you know, and that's hard because obviously in a real case, there's lots of dry testimony. You don't call it testimony. I've been told that by a lawyer. You call it evidence. So there's a lot of dry evidence, but you just have to root through as a novelist. And because I'm not a lawyer, I feel a little bit more able to take creative license. So there are specific things that my kind of consulting lawyers have told me that this wouldn't happen. And I'm like, yeah, but it would really help to build tension. And so I do feel a bit more able that, okay, if I've done 100% research, I can kind of pull it back to 70% for the sake of the story. And because I kind of see them as more contemporary thrillers and kind of commenting on social issues, less kind of pure legal thrillers, I feel a little bit more able to do that.
Because of course, in Take It Back, you weren't writing from the point of view of a lawyer, you were writing from the point of view of a rape crisis helper person. So
yeah, and that was intentional, just because I knew that if she was the barrister, she would have very limited contact with the complainant. Whereas in Take It Back, it was really important for me to have the protagonist talk to the complainant and for their relationship to be very central to the story. And so without doing some kind of incredible acrobatics, I thought that was the kind of setup that worked for the case of the novel.
Yeah.
William, when you're deciding about cases that you've done that you might write into a novel, what do you look for?
Oh, what do I look for? I don't. I quite like to know an ending before I start writing the beginning. That's always a good thing to know. My books don't spend an awful lot of time in court, which is maybe seems strange for being legal thrillers, or maybe there's only a couple of chapters possibly per book where you're actually in court. The criminal defence lawyer in Scotland, the solicitor, is more like a private eye, and that's what Robbie Munro is, because the solicitor, in my younger days when I was a young lawyer, and legal aid was good back those days, there was so much investigation went in, and you went out and you went to witnesses' houses and you went everywhere and you spoke to witnesses. My very, very first case, when I was still at university, I was a precognition officer, and he said, go away to this rough part of Edinburgh, and I had to go and speak to this man whose daughter had been raped to take a precognition. I've never run so fast in my life after I opened the door, because I had to get away from, run away and get before he killed me. So you spend a lot of time investigating the case on your feet, meeting witnesses, looking for evidence, looking for things that will help the case, and then you pass it on to Tony, you see, generally speaking.
We just get the glory.
Yeah. Although in Scotland, certainly speaking, your solicitor can go all the way. And I speak to juries in the sheriff court, but they can only get 5 years. If I apply to speak in the High Court, well, I could do that, but then frankly, I wouldn't make enough money doing that, because I've got a business to run, unless I'd have to leave it and go to the bar. And that's a good choice, because you get good money there, but I've got an office to run and I can't take time away. I can't spend 3 weeks in the High Court, for instance, really, not nowadays anyway, because I keep going back to legal aid. I'm on the telly tonight on BBC Scotland, right? And I interviewed for 50 minutes with Professor David Wilson about miscarriages of justice, and I've been edited down to about, I don't know, 8 minutes or something like that. All the stuff about legal aid and my complaints about legal aid have all been cut off.
Get them out now.
That's where my criticisms of forensic scientists, because they do make terrible mistakes sometimes. And in this book here, I highlight that, because I've witnessed some real big bloopers from the forensic scientists, and yet in so many books, and juries love forensic scientists, of course, but in so many books about forensic scientists, they find a hair and they can work out from that it belonged to this dog, and it was that guy, and it gets the murderer. But it's just, in reality, they're just humans, and very clever, a lot of them, but they kind of jump to conclusions. And on the telly tonight, what they were talking about is this idea where you have, and you put the camera, it's called now, when you have it in your mind what you want the result to be, and the forensics will find it. And that's extremely dangerous.
Confirmation biased, I think.
Yeah, confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias, that's exactly what it is. And I was at a book talk, Bloody Scotland, a few years ago. This bit got cut out of my talk tonight as well. But I was Bloody Scotland a few years ago. In the crowd, just in the spectating, and there was a very famous forensic scientist from Scotland speaking. And she came on and she said, I've just been working on a big murder case, but I'm pleased to say we got him. And I thought, what do you mean we got him? I mean, you're not a policeman.
Incredible.
You're the independent forensic scientist who's supposed to be. Do you know what I mean? You never.
I had this at the beginning of the year. I was defending an attempted murder in the Old Bailey, and in came the telephone expert. And what William just said is absolutely right. Experts, regardless of who instruct them, whether it's instructed by the defence or the prosecution, the expert is independent. And this guy, I spoke to him outside, all reasonable. He got into a witness box and he just gave evidence as if this is absolutely correct. This is where this man was. He couldn't have been anywhere. Telephone evidence is generally very, 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 very overrated. You can tell, it's very good to tell you where a phone is not.
Yeah.
You can tell categorically that a telephone, not the user, but not the owner, because who knows if they've got it with them. But you can tell categorically that a telephone is not in a particular place if it's hitting a particular cell. What you cannot tell is where it is. It could be with anywhere within, so lesser in degrees of certainty, a 5 kilometre, 180 degree position one way or the other. No, almost 180. And this, you get these experts who get in there and do exactly what you just said. They are taking sides. And I ultimately had this, after about a day and a half of cross-examining, I had this expert admit that he was completely wrong. And that that it was far more likely that it was 2 miles in a different direction than it was. But yet, if I hadn't had been on top of the material, and if I hadn't understood cell sites to the extent that I understand them, I'm quite interested in them. Sadly, quite pathetic, but I'm very interested in the cell sites. And if it had been somebody who was less interested in them or less on top of it, he would have simply given evidence that this cell site proved that Mr. X was at a certain place at a certain time, and that was totally consistent with the murder. Right. Where in reality, or the attempted murder, in reality, it was the exact opposite. So I know exactly what you mean, William. It's very, very frustrating.
Yeah, I was involved in a shadowing thing where I shadowed an expert, and it is very vague, and especially when you're talking about witness intimidation, it's important to know where everyone is. Yeah. And if it's not done right, it can be dangerous. So, yeah.
It goes actually slightly beyond that in England, though. In England, and I know you don't have lay magistrates up in Scotland, do you? Or do you? We have justices of the peace act as magistrates in very, very minor cases. Yeah. Well, about 90%, 85 to 90% of all criminal cases are dealt with in England by lay magistrates in a magistrates court. Yeah. Vast majority of them. And I'm sure some of them are really good. But my experience of them over the course of 20 years has been that they should abolish that now. It is the most unfair tribunal in the world. I was once told by an usher who I'd gone along, and I was about 10 years called by this point. I was very rarely in the magistrates court. If I was in one, it's because I was getting paid to be there privately. And so it's no self-aggrandizing to say that I was rather more experienced than my opponent. And the usher came out and said to me, said, "Mr. White, you need to hear what's happened in there." I said, "Well, what's happened?" And they said, "I just overheard them say that if our girl, i.e. the prosecutor, if our girl was as good as him, she would have proved the case." And then they came back and convicted. I mean, that's just, it's horrifying. It really is horrifying. Yeah. But anyway, we're probably going off tangents. So.
It's all right. Tangents are one of the most interesting things because it makes me come up with more unusual questions. And I was just thinking about how, as writers, lawyers have to construct cases, and I was just thinking, is there anything that you guys have learned from writing that you've ended up constructing when doing the actual cases?
I have. I'm not going to tell you what it is. I'm not using it in court yet. But in my latest book, the
hold that up, William. Hold it up.
I'm not sure you've seen it or not. In my latest book, as part of these days in court, if someone can't remember, doesn't speak up their evidence, they can now put their statement to them. And of course, a statement is taken by a policeman who probably put in it what he hoped they'd say as opposed to what they actually did say. And the choice the person gets then is to say, yes, my statement to the police was correct, or no, it wasn't correct. Because if you say it wasn't correct, it's basically, you know, oh, you're lying to the police then. Oh, no, I wasn't lying to the police. Well, you're lying now. No. So they always go along with what was in their statement, even though half the time it's a lot of rubbish and made in the heat of the moment. So I had Robbie come up with a cunning plan how to get around that, and I've not tried it. I've not seen anybody else try it in court yet either. So I'm gonna try it. So I'm not going to tell you what it is. But at the end of my book, all my books I always basically tell you what the story was based on. And in this one, it gives you an example, as we talked about before, of the forensic scientists, as pathologists in this case, making a really, really stupid case, just a mad case that a mistake anybody would make. But it made a difference to my client. It was another murder case, and there was another mistake that got him off. So that's why I've been a bit harsh on the old forensic scientists in that particular book. Hope there's none watching.
We'll know about it if there are. In my case, I've not learned anything for my job from writing, to be honest, more the other way around. Apart from, I have learned something for my job from being a writer, if that makes any sense. I hosted a couple of tables at a couple of different Harrogates and other festivals where they do the crime night. And so you host a table and everyone will sit there and there'll be the crime acted out and everyone will then debate it and decide who did it. And apart from my taking great offence that the likes of Lee Child don't seem to know anything about pre-interview disclosure. So there was one particular case where it could only be one of the suspects. It could only be because they knew something that only the killer would know. And it turned out not to be them. So I got quite annoyed. So hang on a second, right? That's just you're throwing red herrings in for the hell of it. But ignoring that, what I found was, having listened to all of the evidence, and also we all had all the statements as well, I listened to everybody, and some of the madness and off-the-wall stuff they were coming out with. But where has that come from? That cannot have come from anywhere. That's not in any of the statements. You're making that up. And so what I've learned is that I think I may have overestimated some juries. And I slightly overestimated just how much they listen to the evidence and don't just make stuff up. Because if this was sort of a microcosm of a jury, then it was crazy. It was just apparently two of the suspects were having a gay affair at some point. There was nothing in there at all to suggest that, and yet 3 different people around the table reached the same conclusion. So I was just thinking, okay, I think I'll learn from this when next jury speech.
So it's slightly different for you, Keir, as you say, as you're not a lawyer, but you've learned from your friends that are.
Oh gosh, not that way round. As kind of Tony said, I've learned a lot about the law that I've kind of applied to writing, but not really the other way around. I suppose the most important life advice I've learned is you can't take pictures in a London Crown Court because you might get arrested. And so I'm not saying that I have or haven't. I'm saying that you're not meant to.
Don't incriminate yourself.
I didn't read into that at all.
What would you say is the most interesting or complicated case that you've either seen or heard about or been involved in? We'll start with Mark. William. We'll start with William. Yeah.
Oh, it would take too long to go into it, I'm afraid. I had a very long, drawn-out murder case, which finished in 2015 or 16, and there was a great deal of it was a culmination of actually a series of trials which were all connected. 4 trials to do. There was 5 people accused of some drug importation of cocaine, and at the end of the day, there was only kind of 1 of them left. It's a bit like, you know, 10 Little Indians or whatever is the politically correct title of that book now. And my client was the last man standing, and it was a murder charge of one of his co-accused, and that was an example where the police just thought, this is the guy, let's just fit him up. And it's also the same case as I mentioned to you earlier, where I had to do that, recognize a person from many years before about what time a shop closed. And that really was a major part of the case. There's also a very interesting punctuation part of the case as well, because the Crown thought that they had a really strong point, because my client, who was found not guilty eventually, he had given a very long interview to the police, 3.5 hours. And I'd told him, look, don't say anything. That's kind of my everyone's stock advice usually. In Scotland, you don't have to say anything to the police, and nothing can be read into it. In England, I think they can use that and say, well, why didn't you say that to the police at the time? But they can't do that in Scotland. So I will say, just say nothing at all. But he didn't. He spoke for 3.5 hours to the police, and everything he said kind of was correct. It was really good. It was, but there was one bit in it which he made a mistake. But he hadn't made a mistake. It was they'd missed out a comma in the transcript, and it was only when you heard it played in court that it's too hard to explain. But I did write a wee. I've got on my website. I've got blogs, and I think I do make reference to it on there, about how punctuation is extremely important, generally speaking, but it was also very important in that particular case.
I think there was a case a few years ago, wasn't there, that a company had to pay out, I think $2.6 million, was it, because of a misplaced comma?
It was, and I referred to that. I think I referred to that case in my blog, that is a mistake that was made there. And yeah, I know it's crazy but the Crown thought this was a really strong point, and it was on paper. But this punctuation mark actually wasn't a comma; it was actually a full stop. They made all the difference. But I think I was reading on Twitter that full stops alarm certain people nowadays. Is that correct?
Yeah. Kia, is there anything?
I mean, I can't name a specific case, but I'm really interested in the kind of assisted dying, and Tony and William will correct me, I'm sure, but I think as a rule, people who kind of help other people die or euthanasia don't tend to get prosecuted. But I just find that area really interesting and kind of set up. So in my next novel, that's probably something I'll examine. You know, where do we draw the line? What if a child is living in agony? Is it morally correct to help that child die, or the kind of stringent moral ethics of it? And so it's not clear in my head, but that kind of area is really fascinating to me. So that's probably what I'll be kind of plumbing in my next book.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Yeah, definitely is. Mainly because of how complicated it might be to try and deal with it. There'll be a lot of areas you can cover with that. Tony, is there any cases that you could talk to us about that you think have like influenced you in what you've been writing?
I don't think any of them really influenced me in my writing, if I'm honest. I've written a legal thriller, of course, as I said, Marked for Death, but most of the, there's not a huge amount of legal elements to the things I write. The sort of more political action thrillers. I think just the confidence to write, really. I think it's just what I've done for a living, because it's telling stories. Telling stories to juries for 20 years has given me the confidence to be able to do things like this. Given me the confidence to be able to talk to a blank screen trying to publicize a book, and given me the confidence to know that I can hold attention. You know, I know I can hold attention when I'm speaking to a jury, so I'm confident I can hold attention with a book. So I'm not really, in terms of any particular cases, I think apart, well, I guess I did say earlier that I stole a few cross-examinations from a few of them. So I guess they have to count. But, but as William said earlier, to try to look back and think of an interesting case, I've been doing sort of very serious crime for a very long time, and I've represented quite a lot of famous people. I probably can't tell you about almost any of them. I've been involved in some very, very long cases, and I had one murder case, for example, that basically lasted 7 years because we had a trial. We then appealed it. The appeal was finally successful when fresh evidence came to light. We had a trial. We lost again. We then appealed that because huge dishonesty occurring in both trials, and dishonesty of a different sort. And ultimately, we had 2 convictions. We had both convictions overturned. In both of those cases, we didn't get leave to appeal. The judge told us there were no legs to it at all. And so we had to just press on anyway, which means you don't get paid up to a certain point. You're basically doing it for free. So I could give you lots and lots of examples, but we'll be here all day. So I won't.
I was, because in your books, you've split the narrative to make it more international. So why did you do that? What was the inspiration for that? Because it does make it a little bit different to the normal legal thrillers.
Well, the main reason for it, to be honest, was I wanted to have a bigger canvas to play on. I don't think that as a lawyer who is in the Crown Court most days, I couldn't keep writing legal thrillers. I just couldn't do it because my stuff is relatively high concept, relatively high end stuff. And, Michael Devlin gets himself into all these different scrapes. It just doesn't happen. I mean, it's one thing for him to get into those scrapes a couple of times, but I just wouldn't. I know that it's fiction, but I just couldn't bring myself to keep writing him getting into the fistfights and the shootouts and the various things that he gets involved in the books that he's in. Yeah. And I wanted to go more in the direction of, I want to keep writing about Michael, but I like the existence of Joe Dempsey being Michael's friend and being an international intelligence agent with the United Nations. It gives him a really big canvas, and Michael can be dragged into stuff because he knows Joe Dempsey. He can be dragged into stuff, and it's incidental that he's a lawyer, which I think for me is important, because if he kept getting dragged into stuff because he's a lawyer, at some point I'd kill myself. I was just sitting there thinking, I can't write more of this stuff.
Yeah, because in all 3 of your books, I would say that it's the non-legal characters, the ones that the background characters that made it really appealing to me. I mean, what was it about writing those for all 3 of you? Yeah, for all of you. Yeah.
For me, Zara, Zara Khalil in my novels is the kind of main protagonist, and she is an ex-barrister turned rape counsellor, and she was really compelling because she has a legal background, but she's not constrained by the law. So, what Tony was saying, if you are a lawyer, then you have these kind of stringent law rules that you have to stick by, and so that gave me a little bit more leeway, which is why I think lots of people who write kind of police procedurals will have their detective kind of working off the books, or they will go with a PI instead of a detective, because then your character has more leeway. For me, Zara was really interesting. I wanted to make her an Asian protagonist just because there was the cultural element to it. Take it back, the kind of crux of it was really to examine how we tend to judge people based on what they look like or what they believe in. And so that kind of juxtaposition of her as a Muslim not in the legal sense, but on the side of a complainant who was accusing 4 Muslim boys of rape, that was really interesting, because then the kind of public get involved, and the mob justice and the kind of Twitter justice, all of that was really interesting to me and just makes for high drama. And so I wanted her to be an inherently divisive character. And so, yeah, that's why I went to Zara.
Yeah. William, you got a lot of support characters in the office in your books, and the daughter as well. What was helpful in writing those characters?
My chair's slowly sinking here, right? Yeah, no, there's lots of returning characters in my books, and a large supporting cast of people, including Alec Monroe, of course, who is Robbie's father, who's an ex-policeman with a very dim view of Robbie's chosen career. You know, getting people out of jail. Lee spent his whole career putting people into jail. There's his secretary, of course. He's also got his now wife. Now, I've spoiled that for you, possibly, Alec, because I know you read Last Will recently.
Yeah.
Which my publishers will call book number 1, but it's actually book number 6, because 5 of my books were self-published before the publisher picked me up. And so my self-published books are called the Best Defence series, and the publisher Sandstone Press's books are called the Robbie Monroe thrillers, but they just all kind of follow on from each other. But it's amazing how your supporting cast sort of grow as organically, as a good word to use, as the book progresses or the series progresses. Because in book 1, I had a character called Joanna Jordan. Now, I just gave her that daft name, Joanna Jordan, as because she was only in it for a paragraph. You know, I just needed somebody in it for a paragraph to do something and go away again. And she wasn't in the book until a couple of appearances in book 3. And then suddenly, before I know it, Robbie's now been married to her for the last 2 books, you know, and in the latest book, she's kind of, it's almost like a husband and wife team more than a single individual. So it's amazing how your characters take a life of their own, and they go off and do stuff almost out with your control. But one thing I will say, people. Strong female characters. People, this is the thing that people want: strong female characters. I had my own problems with strong female characters in my very first book because I was a man and people thought I couldn't write about a strong female character. But what people have said, my characters, strong characters are females, are all very strong. But the thing is, I don't know about you lot, but you know, you write what you know. My wife's a very strong character. My secretary is like, you know, you just don't mess with her. My boss from years go by, very, very, I mean, my boss was not a feminist. She didn't think women should bring them down to the level of men. Do you know what I mean? She was a complete. So when you write about what you know, and I think there is, it's good to have Robbie's got lots of different females in his life in the early stages because he is entirely irresistible to women. Do you know what I mean? He's not like what's his name, Jack Reacher, who all women kind of love him. You can't go anywhere without somebody throwing themselves at him from a great height. He's a trier, and he does eventually succeed. He does eventually succeed, like some of us do as well, punching above his weight. So I think your question was about the background characters. I've got lots of background characters, and they kind of feature in all the books one way or another, even just a cameo. Yeah. Sometimes they have a kind of a whole book to themselves almost, and then other times they just pop in because I think people will miss them if they don't drop in for a chapter or 2. Yeah,
Tony, yours is with yours being global. The supporting characters there's a lot of them.
There are a lot of them. They're I like supporting characters. I like writing them. I like to have. I said at the outset that my current book, Power Play, begins with a plane blowing up, and it blows up after about 7 pages. And I was very keen that people would want to read that book about those characters. And even though I know they're going to die after 7 pages, they're all going to die in the same explosion. But I wanted people to want to read the book, and I feel that way about almost all of my backing characters. I want people to want to know more about them, and I want to know more about them. And you never know who's going to sort of spiral off. I'm currently writing my 4th book, and unlike the others, it's quite difficult because I'm trying to write it as they can all be read as standalones. You get a bit more if you don't read them as standalones, but they can all be read as standalones. But the 4th one is almost a sequel to the first one. Someone's coming back. A couple of there's connections to the first one. So it's quite difficult to write that as something that can be read as a standalone. I hope I'm achieving it. But again, I'm getting to go back to those characters now, who I never thought I'd come back to, but it just seems to work to bring them back in. And I love the idea to have this little universe rather than having, You know, you haven't just got this one character who's walking through the world doing whatever. It's almost, you've got a universe, and you can just go back to it and just pluck people out and say, well, actually, yeah, you'd be really useful in this circumstance, and you still exist. I haven't killed you yet, so bring you up. And I think if you really work on your characters in that way, and you make each person a kind of a living, breathing thing, then it makes the book a bigger experience, I think. It certainly makes writing the book a bigger experience.
I think if we've got 5 minutes, audience questions along the side, is that any that picked out? Yeah.
Somebody asked about do any of your clients or any of the people that you've represented think that they recognise themselves in the book or think you've written about them? The answer to that for me is no, they haven't yet, because I haven't written about them. But I have killed a lot of my friends. I've turned a lot of friends into characters, and they very rarely make it through the
book. Has anybody else done that?
Oh. Yeah. Some people have recognised themselves in my book, even though they're not actually in the books. I don't know how they do that.
I've had that as well. I know that's me. It's not you. You're not that interesting.
but I do have one supporting character in my book who pops in quite often, and he's a bit of a villain, Jake Turpey, and he's in the books that different. He's in most of the books, if not them all, to some degree. And I had a guy at my house doing some joinery work. He said, you know, I don't read books. He said, but my wife was reading one of your books, and she said, oh, you're at that guy's house doing work. So I read the book, and I really liked it. And I said, I think I know who Jake Turpey is. And I said, no, you don't know who Jake Turpey is. He said, yeah, I do. And he told me who Jake Turpey was, and he was right. I said, what you don't tell him. So there we are. But so yeah, people do recognise them, but more often than not, they recognise themselves and they're not there. So you know, you can just.
I definitely see conversations that I've had in real life, you know, because sometimes you just meet characters that were built for fiction in real life, and so I will sometimes literally write down something that I've heard in public or that somebody said to me, and then use it in fiction. And I know that if that person then picked up the book, they would recognise the conversation, but. Sometimes it's too good not to use.
Oh yeah, I do that all the time. I've always got my notebook where when I hear someone say something stupid, I write it down. Brilliant.
I'm like that with names. Whenever I hear a good name, I'm rubbish at thinking up names.
Names are quite important. You don't want to have a mundane name because people won't remember it from one chapter to the next. But then again, you don't want to have some kind of outlandish, crazy name either. You want something memorable, but you know, not too zany.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, memorable names are key. What is the most memorable name you've thought you might use, but then decided, hang on, they'll know it's them?
I almost called one of my two lead characters. One's Joe Dempsey. I almost called him Jack Dempsey. And then I just thought I can't get away with it. I can't have if this works, I can't have a long series about a guy called Jack Dempsey. So I switched him round. My brother's called Joe, so he became Joe Dempsey. Right. A name that I did use is Wisdom Penfold, and everybody thinks that's made up, but that's actually a friend of my uncle's. And when my uncle mentioned that name, I had to go in. That was immediately put into a book.
Yeah. I think we've only got about a minute left, so if you guys could sum up what's coming next for you. I know it's the open question, but yeah.
Right. Well,
my book is out on Thursday next week, along with about 600 other books. So doing little bits and pieces of PR for that, and then working on the next book.
Yeah.
Well, my next book, which I think I've shown you the cover of it already, so I'll not bother.
One last time.
Keep the theme going.
It's out the 22nd of October, but you see, I don't write during the summer. I just kind of have other things to do, so I don't really start writing every year until September, and I try and finish in February or March. So, and then always do a bit of editing and all that. But
yeah.
I just try and take the summer off to do other things.
Yeah.
Well, my next one, my fourth book, is out next year. It all takes place actually in the book on the 27th of July next year. So I'm really hoping my publishers agree to release it on the 27th of July next year.
Right.
It all takes place in the course of one day. It's set on the west coast of America, beginning at the Florida Keys, moving its way up to Philadelphia. Basically it's almost a sequel to my first book. It's all about the movement of some materials that shouldn't be in the country and what they could be used for and who's behind it and why.
Right. And Alec, thanks very much for not asking us any COVID-19 questions, because I thought, you know, I'm fed up hearing about it. I've just ignored it in this book here.
Yeah.
Because I finished writing that book in sort of the very end of February, and of course COVID-19 was something that was happening to other people in China, and it wasn't anything to do with Britain really. So it's kind of it doesn't get a mention, other than the foreword saying it's not got a mention because it hadn't happened yet. So
yeah, it's not a problem. I've tried to avoid it too. Yeah.
Annoyingly, it's found its way into mine. I was very against it, but it's found its way in.
Well, it's hard. If you're in the middle of it and you're writing, I don't know how you can avoid it. You know, it's just so difficult. You know. Hopefully, it'll go away and we can get back to normal.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Yeah.
I'd like my next one to not come out during a lockdown. Power Play came out on the 16th of April, so we were bang in the middle of the lockdown.
Yeah, not great.
It's quite hard to advertise a book when no one's outside.
Yeah. I think